Please welcome the host of Cyber Threats and National Strategies, A Global Perspective, Chris Inglis, and esteemed panelists.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session on Cyber Threats and National Strategies, A Global Perspective. I think it's not hard to miss that there are about 44,000 people in San Francisco this week from 45 countries, all, I think, with shared aspirations. Aspirations that how do we make critical infrastructure based on digital infrastructure, cyberspace, how do we make it meet our expectations? How do we make it meet the expectations of all of those that governments are charged to serve in a world where they don't simply use the same technology, they're up against the same challenges. Here to help us explore that are three kind of world-renowned, literally world-renowned experts on that. To my immediate left, Despina Spanou, the Deputy Director General of Cybersecurity and Trust for the EU, 27 sovereign nations in all, last time I took a look. Next to her is Director Yoichi IIDA from Japan, their National Cyber Director. And then finally, last but not least, Ambassador Jessica Hunter from Australia, the Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology Ambassador. They will help us explore today the issues of what's the government's role in serving the needs of, I used a term earlier in the formation of this, civil society, and someone asked me, do you mean people who behave well? Is that what you mean by civil society? No, that's a relatively small number of people. What we mean by civil society is all of the folks that constitute society, not just the national security elements, not just the defense of government infrastructure, not just the defense of what we may call critical infrastructure, all of cyber that works for all of the citizens that kind of populate the countries. And it's noteworthy that of the 45 countries represented at RSA this year, 29 of them are represented on the stage. If you count the EU as kind of bringing 27, so thank you so much. So I'm going to start by framing this and then turn it over to some opening remarks. I'll just say up front that I think all of us are aware that systems of interest that serve human needs classically are comprised of many things, but I like to formulate that as they're comprised of some technology, that's a facet of the modern world, skills, human behaviors, skills, choices that humans make. They're not merely served by these systems, their choices kind of determine the future and the performance of these systems. In a perhaps somewhat subtler word, doctrine, meaning the assignment of roles, expectations, who does what. And in order to get those right, we have for systems like automobile transportation systems, air transportation systems, healthcare systems, typically define those in the reverse order. We first try to figure out who's responsible for what and setting the system up so it'll meet our expectations. Doctrine. We then try to figure out what the role of the human being is in that system might be, both as the human is served by that system, but what's the role that the human has, what accountability do they have to perhaps participate in that system. And then we bend technology to that purpose. So that's a framing that I'll use through this panel. Government, since this is a focus on what the government's role might be in serving the needs of the rest of society, typically have various opportunities to participate in that. They can convene, use the bully pulpit to say this is an issue that we should have a discussion about. They can incentivize, they can use the powers of government to make something kind of more beneficial, maybe more profitable. They can collaborate, they can actively participate in these systems. They can gather data, intelligence, or perhaps the collection of data kind of from various parties in the system, and they can do more consequential things. They can regulate or they can punish. And punish not just using cyber methods, but punish using various methods, criminal prosecution, financial sanctions. So those are all of the tools in the toolkit before us. And so let me now begin to tap the expertise of the panel by starting with this question. What in the span of all of what I've just described, the realm of cyber, should the goals of government be in serving the needs of its citizens? And using as a stalking horse, I can still remember the better part of 10, 12 years ago now, the U.S. government's policy was to not stand in and defend the private sector in the presence of a cyber threat because it believed that the private sector kind of had built this as a sovereign territory. Clearly, we're not there anymore. But I'd like to take from each of the panelists, what do you think the role of the government should be, and by extension, the private sector? Despina.
Thank you, Chris. What a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for being here where the world talks security. I just love that. but it brings me a lot of weight on my shoulders as a government official that we're talking security. Because ultimately, the role of all of us as government officials, as civil servants, is to make sure that our citizens are safe. That's what I think about every day when I go to my job, and that's what I'm trying to instill through the work that I'm doing. And in the EU, we have created something that is called a security union, and it's what brings together the 27 countries that Chris mentioned, because the particularity of the EU is that we're not a federal system. We are a union of 27 sovereign countries. So everybody has their own security strategy and approach, but we also have a common approach that we call the security union, and it is a union, as we say, that protects. So this is our motto, the security union that protects. So what have we done to deliver that to our citizens and to our governments as European Union? We have done three things. First, we have gone where we're supposed to be, where no one can miss, and that's critical infrastructure. The European Union was the first part of the world where 27 countries agreed together on a set of common norms to protect critical infrastructure, meaning that we are imposing through rules, through regulation, that all operators of critical infrastructure, in a wide sense of the word, meet the highest level of cybersecurity requirements and standards for their systems, and that they report incidents to the government. It was the first time in the world where we had such an obligation coming for critical infrastructure, and we continue to modernize this legislation because critical infrastructure is where every government must make sure it does not become not only vulnerable because it affects our daily life, but it can become the back door for today's warfare. It can become the way for malicious and state-sponsored actors to reach our societies, destabilize economies, destabilize democracies, destabilize societies. So that's where we should be. The second thing we have done is we have gone into everybody's homes. The Cyber Resilience Act, again, was a first in the European Union. A lot of companies didn't like us at the time when we introduced it, but it is about making sure that connectivity is secure by design. So it is about ensuring that every product that reaches every citizen and that reaches every business has been tested for security. Because in Europe, we were always championing safety, but it did not include the notion of security for connectivity. So through the Cyber Resilience Act that will come into force by the end of this year, every product, every service that is placed in the EU market has to meet security by design, depending on the level of its risk, of course. And the third thing we have done, after we have gone where we should be, after we have gone to people's homes to make sure that everyone is secure, we are going where the geopolitical reality is taking us. We're looking through cybersecurity and the rules of cybersecurity at drones. We're looking at cables because the new challenges are there. This is where the new malicious actors, the malicious actors are looking for new ways of sabotaging our cables that are so important for carrying out our connectivity, our energy, our transport, and how drones should not be used to disrupt our societies, but also how to counter drone threats in a modern way using our cybersecurity tools.
Thank you. Yoichi.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Yoichi, the National Cyber Director of the Japanese government. And actually, Japanese government is now really working very hard on the, how we can mitigate cyber threat and the cyber risks caused mainly by the state-sponsored actors. And actually, we have, enhanced our government capability to mitigate such a risk by state-sponsored actors from the perspective of national security. That's why we have now the national security strategy, which stipulate the three pillars. One is public-private partnership, and the second is the more proactive government authority to monitor the communication information on the internet traffic, or the government will have additional authority to have conduct of the remote access and neutralization measures over the malicious servers and the computers outside, inside, in Japan. And actually, in order to make these measures be effective, we need to have a more enhanced capability as a government. So that's why we set up the new office, National Cybersecurity Office, and I lead this office as the first appointed National Cyber Director. And in order to make our capability be enhanced, we have concluded our national cybersecurity strategy December last year. It has 3 pillars as well. First pillar is deterrence and defense against cyber threat. Second is in order to, deal with such a state-sponsored cyber attacks, we need to have a resilience as a society as a whole. That's why we like to involve all the individuals or even small, medium enterprises to have their own cyber security measures against cyber attack. And the third pillar is we are going to establish our ecosystem inside Japan with talented human resources as well as the emerging technology such as AI or quantum. All these things together we will be able to enhance our defense capability. But it's not the end of the story, because one government, one private sector cannot deal with this very serious environment alone. So that's why we need to have an international collaboration with trusted partners, both foreign government and foreign companies, in order to make sure our defense capability be effectively and efficiently be undertaken together with our partners. So I'm really looking forward today to exchange the views with all of the panelists and Chris, how we can collaborate and how we can enhance our capability together.
Excellent, thank you. Jessica.
Thanks, Chris. May I just extend a thank you to RSA in particular for inviting Australia onto this panel, particularly to Jen Eastley. Not only the Australian government is here, but also our Australian industry, who is part of this broader community, so thank you. I will be quite succinct on this. We have recognised in the Australian government that ultimately cybersecurity and the protection of our citizens who are touching the digital economy is a shared responsibility now. And as Chris has already alluded to, that is a shift from the past where it was either bulk in industry space or heavily in the government space. Really, though, to your question, the role of government is how to set the conditions for that whole of economy and whole of nation approach, how to convene and bring all of the elements together. And ultimately, our goal effectively is to make sure cybersecurity or cyberspace is as safe enough to trust, but open enough to matter. And that is about the balance between that partnership. Within Australia, much like my colleagues, we have also got a cybersecurity strategy, but if you can visualise it, it has 6 shields. And at the core centre of those shields is the Australian citizen and the digital economy. And effectively, each of the shields goes to protecting those individuals. Each of those shields talks to the different roles and functions, particularly of our critical national infrastructure and the responsibility they have for foundational layers. It talks to government's role to balance regulation with innovation, to listen and hear and to adjust, which is what industry provides us very clear guidance on as we need to amend and coordinate. It talks about the different authorities that only government has to deter and deny the adversary, and how we use those as a tool of statecraft when we're using all of our shields together. So ultimately, within the Australian context, it's a shared responsibility, but government helps define those roles and ultimately helps bring the whole of nation approach together. Thanks, Chris.
So Jessica, let's stick with you. Excellent round of opening remarks. The reality, perhaps the saltwater crocodile in the room, if I might, is that there is limited time and capital to address all the perils in this space, to kind of address all the aspirations in this space. There is talk across various governments of biasing the efforts of government towards more offense, or biasing the efforts more to the private sector in terms of having responsibility for resilience, either through incentives or through the imposition of consequences, of forming coalitions. Which of those at the moment are the trends that we should be thinking about? Where perhaps should we make choices in a world where we have limited resources to do all the things we want to do? Jessica.
Thanks, Chris. It's the challenge that every defender faces and every nation has to prioritise. If I could give a bit of scene setting, in the Australian context, our Australian Signals Directorate, which has the Australian Cybersecurity Centre within it, every year does a threat analysis to understand what has shifted and changed in our environment. And importantly, we look at not only the shift in the TTPs and the threat actors and their approaches into networks, but also the severity and impact. And I raise those because each of those elements helps us do, as Chris has flagged, the prioritisation. So just a couple of quick reflections from the Australian perspective. We have seen an increase in obviously the sophistication, but the techniques used by a range of different actors, which is reflective of the geostrategic environment we're operating in. But really importantly, some critical stats. In terms of public vulnerabilities disclosed and identified, there's an increase of 27%. And I know those in the audience know most of those aren't new vulnerabilities. Those have been around for a while, but they're recently being exploited. We've also seen the increase in cybercrime at a national level, where we have a report into our national centre, one every 6 minutes, which has been a significant increase from one in every 10 minutes only 2 years ago. But it's the techniques that we've seen where they can scale now, particularly creating botnets out of Soho routers, their ability to really get into the citizens and the heart of our population. But the impact is what I really want to pull on here. The cost to the economy and the cost to the individual citizens is up 50% in terms of monetary component for the businesses. So you take that threat picture, including data breaches where nearly 20 million customers have had personal records exposed through Medibank and Optus in Australia. And to your point, Chris, you do ask, where do we focus, where do we put our priorities? For Australia, our setting is shifting away from awareness and really into resilience, and in particular, national preparedness. And in order to answer that question, you really need to look at where are the most critical sectors and define those sectors and help those sectors reach the maturity level of what good looks like. So Australia over the last 2 or 3 years has changed our legislation to be really descriptive to industry, to help industry understand not just whether their sector is critical for the broader economy, but actually what are the critical assets within their entities. And then ultimately setting the standard of what good looks like and helping the critical infrastructure systems in particular and that sector elevate to reach that maturity. So that is both an incentivization and then obviously a regulatory function. But that is really a very, very clear message of looking after the most critical assets. The other piece is very much leveraging industry and small, medium businesses and being very explicit on their roles. Small to medium enterprises and businesses don't have the capability and the capital to protect their networks at the level of the foundational critical national infrastructure. So how do we tailor a different package to meet their needs to do that level of protection? And then third and final is how do we actually scale out to protect the citizen level? And that is really how do we do capability such as secure by default, but also put labelling schemes in particular into Internet of Things devices, for instance, so the citizen doesn't have to make some of those choices. Ultimately, they're being given a product that is already secure for them at the get-go. So from the Australian perspective, it's resilience, but really that shift to national preparedness and sending a really clear demand signal to which are the most critical sectors in our society.
Excellent. Yoichi, transitioning a little bit to Japan's situation, you've most recently developed and delivered a very impressive national strategy. It includes facets like active cyber defense and other measures. Perhaps a Japanese perspective on what Jessica just walked through. What are the things that you're emphasizing? What are the trends in Japan's view?
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, key concept of our new cybersecurity strategy is imposing the cost over the cyber attackers and adversaries. In order to make this happen, we introduced active cyber defense by new cyber legislation enacted last May, and now we are working hard to prepare full implementation of this legislation. Actually, there are 2 points I would like to emphasize here is we will expand the information sources by this legislation. Firstly, the information will come from private sectors, three ways. One is pre-legislation of the important computer for their operation to the government. And the second is mandatory incident reporting to the government by around 300 critical infrastructure operators. And the third, we are going to set up a public-private partnership council. It is really similar with the probably Trust Group in UK or GCDC in the United States, and probably Australia has a similar framework. Through this council or through this group, we are going to exchange the information, even sensitive or proprietary information or classified information among government and private sector, so we can increase the source of information. Then, second point I would like to emphasize here is we like to take proactive action as earliest possible stage of cyber attack. That's why we like to fully take advantage of policy options available for us. And also, we like to explore the additional policy measures which only government can undertake or only government can deliver meaningful results more rather than private sectors. Then we could have a synergy between the government and the private sectors in order to maximize our defense capability against cyber attackers. That's the clear change or shift in our policy for cyber security.
See great consistency in that. Despina, you're in a particularly advantageous place because you can reconcile, rationalize 27 nations at once. I don't mean to make that sound easier than it is. But what's your view on that in terms of what those trends are across that population?
So we come in to add for the top-up of security because, of course, every country is sovereign, as I mentioned, and they have their own security strategies and their own way of doing security. What we come in to do is to do what Europe does best, bring people together, to work together, to exchange together, to make sure that one learns from the other. So we do three things. The first is we cooperate. We have a lot of mechanisms for bringing the 27 government experts together. We do that at CERT level. So we have a cooperation group of our CERTs, the emergency response teams of all 27 countries that meet regularly, that discuss, and that act every time there is an incident in one country. They act as information for all the others so that we avoid sort of domino effect of incidents in Europe, learn from each other, etc. We also have a crisis mechanism for the 27 countries that we work together, and it's called the EU Cyclone. It was established by our NIS2 legislation. It is about managing together. It's for the decision makers. It's at high level. And we also regularly exchange information, and we activate every time there's a conflict, for instance, like in the current situation, and we exchange so that we know what's going on in one country, and that prevents things from spilling over to another, etc. So this cooperation is something that we now have also taken to the next level, because I think in today's world it's impossible to prepare yourself for threats just because you have excellent threat landscape reporting or excellent threat information. It's just not enough. You need, though, to invest in awareness. So in Europe, we are now creating cybersecurity hubs between different countries. So we even financed that from the European Union. And different member states have come in and have created collective threat assessment hubs. So they collect together information, they analyze it, and they share it with each other. And that is, of course, a great force for our awareness. And of course, we have the EU Cybersecurity Agency called ENISA. You may know it. It produces one of the state-of-the-art threat landscape reports every year. That is also part of our guidance in the EU as to where we go for our preparedness. And that's the third thing, preparedness. I think you need to always be prepared for the improbable in cybersecurity. They're not going to tell you when it's coming, what it's going to be like. The big crisis is an accident waiting to happen. You just need to be prepared. And to be prepared, you need the people. We have an issue with a huge cybersecurity skills gap. You and I have discussed that extensively, Chris. We continue to invest. We even created the Cybersecurity Skills Academy in the European Union. Again, collective effort of 27 governments. and pledges from many, many of you in the room, many companies. All the big tech companies of the Silicon Valley have offered pledges to train people, to certify people, to bring more people in the workforce, people from all possible professions, not just computer scientists. We need people from all possible efforts of life. And then we have also created the EU Cyber Reserve. The EU Cyber Reserve is, in fact, a list of professionals that can step in and help any country that may need it in case of a large-scale incident. People who are attested on the basis of very specific criteria. They can come from the public sector, they can come from the private sector. So it's about bringing people together for your preparedness. And last but not least, the other advantage of the EU is that we carry out exercises at the level of 27 countries with the participation of everyone, and we take very topical issues to address in our exercises. And we also do joint exercises with NATO as part of our preparedness. So awareness and preparedness is key.
Excellent. I love that you brought up the human piece of this. If I might use the moderator's privilege, the most recent people strategy in cyberspace for the US, probably about 3 years old now. But it took an all many few approach, meaning that everyone in cyberspace needs to be closer to being digital natives than app natives, meaning some knowledge about what the consequences of their actions are. We all know that if you click on a link, it's somebody else's code with your privileges. The most powerful, possibly beneficial, often dangerous combination. But not everyone knows that. So there's an all piece of this. There's a many piece of this, which there are many professions that don't see themselves as being implicated in the plot. Lawyers, CEOs, logisticians, they don't know that the choices they make, kind of educated in institutions that have been doing it for millennia, actually have implications in cyberspace. So we need to get into those curricula, those training programs, and make sure that they know. And then there's a few, relative few. In the United States, I think we're only short 300,000 people at the moment in IT and cyber jobs, but that's not 360 million. And we need to focus on them to better educate them, better recruit them, better equip them. So I love that you've mentioned that. I think that humans remain at the center of this proposition. I don't know, Jessica or Yoichi, do you want to add anything more to that, the people piece? Let's jump another shark here. So kind of we're looking for then some transition of government roles in this space, maybe a transformation of government roles in this space, and you've each spoken very positively about that. But transformations, in my kind of experience, are based on the back of real work. So let's take the supply chain as an opportunity for real work. Supply chains ruthlessly cross national borders. They're a common resource, a shared hazard for many nations, if not all nations. So how do we get those right without, I'll put some limitations on this, compounding the burden for those who deliver supply chains with regulations that come from many sources that are not rationalized, and without believing that we might kind of put everything in one single place and suffer the reduced efficiency, the reduced redundancy that comes from that. We've now seen what happens when you put a data center in a country that is engaged in some kinetic conflict. If they're relying wholly on that, that might not be the best way to achieve the sort of resilience you're looking for. So having said all of that, how should we approach supply chains? Despina, maybe we'll start with you.
So in Europe, we have finally taken the step of proposing regulating that as well. You wouldn't be surprised. Because we tried voluntary means through our very first effort 6 years ago. We proposed a toolbox for removing high-risk suppliers from our 5G mobile networks, something that you have also done in this country. And until now, we have almost half of the EU member states that have done so, but we realized that it was not bearing the fruit that we wanted, and we still had issues. And inspired from that and given all the challenges with supply chain issues in recent years, we have now proposed, and it is currently before the co-legislator in the EU, a modern framework for removing high-risk suppliers from our supply chains in ICT. This has stirred a lot of debate, but I think it has been welcomed by all governments because it was about time to deal with dependencies that become vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities that become strategic risks, especially at a time where friends become foes, foes become friends, depending on the day of the week sometimes, and the conflicts around us. So it is very important to have mechanisms to deal with high-risk suppliers because that's evident. The problem we have in Europe is that we have certain markets where the dependencies are so high You can't just do it from one day to the next. For mobile networks, we have substitutes, we have other alternative solutions. But in other matters, we don't. So this is why we started work with risk assessments. We have carried out risk assessments in a number of areas, moving from mobile networks. We've done it recently for detection equipment, where the dependencies are very high to a certain part, on a certain part of the world. Connected and automated vehicles, another area where we have high dependencies in the supply chain. How do we deal with that? So what we decided to do is we'll carry out such risk assessments in many key areas where we have such dependencies. And then we will identify countries that pose cybersecurity concerns for the EU on the basis of very clear criteria, kind of stemming from the way they do their legislation, obligations they impose on the operators operating in these countries, absence of judicial remedies, no rule of law, etc. So then you make that list, and then you list the suppliers from that country as high risk. A supplier from those countries can also come and ask for an exception, proving that they're out of that system. Of course, there's always a possibility because we are a rule of law region in the European Union. And of course, there are also exceptions of identifying high-risk suppliers outside third countries that have been identified on such a list. So it's a very flexible and modern system. I don't know if the co-legislator will keep it as such, but the idea is to be able to deal with those high dependencies, which in some markets reach 70–80%. Energy is one of them. Detection equipment, as I mentioned, where all your data about what comes in and out of your country, what goes on in your airports, your ports is all there. The dependency goes up to 70% on a certain country's equipment. So I saw yesterday that in the US there was a ban on routers for similar reasons, for instance, from a certain
All routers? That would be better.
from a certain country. From a certain country. That will be the day, yes, when we ban all the routers. And yes, we will all be here with our papers. No, from a certain country. So I think that the world is moving to that direction, where we need to equip ourselves with security in our supply chain, and it will become increasingly complex. I'm very inspired by the discussions on AI in this conference, and I'm aware how AI, agentic AI, is going to make that so complicated. How do you identify high-risk suppliers in this world when you have agentic AI agents speaking to each other and you don't even know who they're speaking to? So I think this is the next big field for all of us.
Great. Excellent. I'm going to come back and dig deeper into regulations, so be ready for that. But before I do, Yoichi and Jessica, do you have anything that you would like to say from your national perspectives about supply chains? How do we get them right?
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually, supply chain issues is really complicated. Firstly, this is a kind of a domestic issue, and also this is an international issue. Now, firstly, I'd like to look this issue either from regulator's perspective or from, say, supplier's perspective. Firstly, even in Japan, most of the critical infrastructure service is heavily regulated, and the government can set the standard or level of cybersecurity in order to make sure that they will provide sustainable services to the national public. Then we expect the supply chain, suppliers and the vendors in the supply chain for critical infrastructure may comply with the same level of the cybersecurity or same scope of cybersecurity in order to continue their transaction with critical infrastructures. It may have some impact over the supply chain's cybersecurity issues. But on the other hand, if I am a supplier who has several users as critical infrastructure operators in the different sectors, then it may cause some problems. Probably different regulators may request different level of cybersecurity for the each critical infrastructure operators. Then, as a suppliers of the same product, we will be suffering from the different requests from important but different customers. So that's why now Japanese government try to have a somewhat streamlined but standardized requirement for suppliers. Then different infrastructure operators in different sectors may have some certain similar level of cybersecurity as their request for their suppliers and vendors. But now we need to consider the international harmonization or international mutual recognition of such a standard or such a classification of the cybersecurity scope and levels. Then we need to discuss these kind of the issues with international partners, how we can make certain level of cybersecurity be implemented in our supply chain, not only for, say, Japanese critical infrastructure, but for the US, European, or Australian infrastructure operators. This is a very complicated, but without overcoming such a different request from different actors, probably suppliers, vendors may be really under the burdensome request. And probably it will increase the cost for the even critical infrastructure operators and for the national public who is receiving the services from critical infrastructure operators.
That's an excellent kind of way to describe that. I love that you brought up the word harmonization with the pun intended. That's music to the ears of the private sector. So, Jessica.
Thanks, Chris. I might build on Yoshi's comment around the global kind of nature of the risk. And a lot of you will have been on Australia's leadership journey around trusted vendors and 5G in particular. I think it's almost 10 years ago now when we initiated that framework. I want to pivot a little bit, though, to that global nature. So you'll see Australia take a further leadership role, though, in recognising that part of the risks globally is also ensuring that we have a leadership role within our region to make sure it is also very resilient. And this goes to supply chain, but more importantly to the global risks we're all facing, and in particular the digital divide. So within the strategy I mentioned earlier, Shield 6 is actually that regional leadership. How do we ensure that the nations closest to Australia that we feel we have an incredibly close partnership with are actually able to ensure that they are resilient and that they then have trusted supply chains and they are using trusted vendors. So within the Australian government, we have an $80 million program which effectively goes into those countries in partnership with them and assists them to uplift and bring in that trusted technology. And if I may just share a little story with you, because they resonate a little bit more with me than some of the regulation as an ops girl. We recently went into the Kingdom of Tonga, who reached out to the Australian government when they had an incident of ransomware which impacted their health sector. So to the earlier conversation about impacting citizens' lives and the role of critical sectors, they picked up the phone and called Australia as a trusted partner to say, can you help me through this crisis? And so from building that support network, helping to allow them to recover, then build resilience in their networks, we brought in industry to support us to do that. So that is the closeness of the public-private partnership as we go into our most trusted region. Then once we had enabled the recovery of the healthcare system, after 2 full days of that system being inactive, we were then able to take the Kingdom of Tonga journey with us and also with New Zealand to actually publicly attribute and call out the specific actors involved in that ransomware incident. So that sort of gives you a sense of how do we create not only trusted technology within our region, but also a partnership which ensures we're much more hardened, not just in our own nation, but in the broader region, to ultimately ensure trusted capability and also prevent the flow of particularly ransomware broadly impacting the broader economy. So it's a slight twist on supply chain, if I may, Chris, but I think it's one of those critical next elements to it.
Appropriately so. You've all, I think, by implication, answered the questions I was going to ask on regulation. I think first and foremost, I don't know of a national strategy that does not mention it. Some whisper it, some shout it, but that word Voldemort, if you're Harry Potter fans, is in every one of those. And it's in strategies for things like automobile transportations, healthcare, so that's not surprising. The second question I was going to ask on that is how do we then aim at that? Despina has kind of talked about it must be risk informed. Others have spoken to the fact that it must be focused on, do we really know what's critical inside those systems? You don't want to regulate the tailpipe of a car in pursuit of automobile safety, so you need to get your focus right. And then it has to be performance-based as opposed to kind of feature-based or compliance-based. And so I think all of that's great. And then kind of credit to you, Yoichi, but everyone kind of nodded when you said it, harmonization. Let's rationalize these things. That would make sense. We're getting close to the end. I'm going to ask one more question of you, but then I'm going to give you the lightning round, which is what's the one thing? So be thinking about that. But all of this belies the means by which governments speak, have a relationship, a discussion with the private sector. How do we do that? Because I found so many in the private sector within the United States, maybe this is the sin I committed, saying, I don't know how to deal with the government. There are 15 different faces, and I don't know which door to show up. If I want to influence this, if I want a relationship with you, a continuous relationship, how do you do that? So how have you, each of you, established that in your countries of interest?
So we actually cannot operate in the EU without a participatory system of governance. So for everything we do, we have to have public consultations for the industry, for the citizens, for everyone. So when we proposed the Cybersecurity Act, it was proposed after a series of consultations. And our politicians are also obliged to hold citizens' dialogues in all the EU countries, the EU member states. We also carry out implementation dialogues. We very often invite our executive vice president, who is in charge of technology and justice, amongst other things, and security. She invites stakeholders for implementation dialogues where they all come in and they tell us what they think about our regulation, not only good things, as you can imagine. And it is on that basis, again, that we have proposed recently a series of simplification measures on our current legislation. We don't just do it because we think it's right. We get the pulse of the industry. And right now, for instance, there is a guidance document out there on our Cyber Resilience Act, the one that I spoke about earlier, which is about security by design in every interconnected product. So we just issued some guidance interpretative for this law, and it is out there for consultation so that stakeholders can give their views. So we do that continuously. I think we champion that because we have to in the EU, but it works wonders.
Thank you. Yoichi.
Thank you very much. And actually, in order to make us be successful in the cybersecurity policy, it is the trusted partnership with private sectors. It's not the regulation. It's not just volunteer actions by private sectors. We need to combine government action and private action together. And actually, I believe that in order to establish such a trusted partnership, first action should be taken by the government. We share our sensitive or classified information with private sectors, and not necessarily sharing the information or limited to the sharing the information. We are going to consult with private sectors what kind of the policy action could be made by the government and also by the government and the private sector together. We are going to make our policy options, or we are going to explore our additional policy measures in the consultation with the private sectors. Then probably I hope that the private sector may provide us with very important technical intelligence or any kind of the proprietary information in order to help government to make a right decision. Thank you.
Excellent. So Jessica, if you could answer that question, then we're going to start the lightning round so you can start that. So what's the nature of the relationship with the private sector, and what's the one thing you want us to take away?
Fabulous. So to the private sector, I think Yoshi's spot on. It's about trust, but you create trust through listening, you create trust through frank dialogue, and you create trust through the action. And so ultimately, the way to test the success there in Australia, we've been very privileged where we put regulation in place around incident reporting. We listened very clearly from government to industry who said, when you're reporting incidents into our Australian Cybersecurity Centre, they are worried that the regulator will then give them a consequence versus the technical support that they needed. So we listened and then took action and adjusted the legislation for a safe harbour or limited use provision. So industry colleagues could engage a technical authority to receive technical support and advice without the fear of the regulation and the consequences there. So that's just a true example of where the trust is built in Australia. To the lightning question, it is trust and partnership. This panel is a demonstration of the partnership. We're all having very robust conversations, not just here in RSA, but behind the scenes. Industry should have confidence that we are also having those conversations directly with you, but there is nothing stronger than the partnership and the trust that comes from that partnership for us to be able to scale to the threat we're facing.
Great, thank you. Yoichi, what's the one big thing to take away?
Yes.
One lesson.
One last. Yeah, let's unite together.
Pardon?
Let's unite together.
Yes.
Against the cyber attack or
I love
cyber
that.
threat.
I love that.
Yeah,
So,
it's simple.
Despina.
Well, we each need to play our role. Governments and private sector, we all need to play our role in security. Nobody can do it alone. So our role is to make sure we work together, that we incentivize each other to do the right thing.
Excellent. So in the minute we have left, I'm going to have the temerity to try to summarize this. I've got some takeaways myself, but I got them all from you. I love that you all started with an affirmative goal of government service to the societies that they're elected or designated to support. That we need to be quite clear about what the government's role is in delivering back, right, to the private sector, to the whole of society. Despina, you talked about setting conditions, right, aligning innovation, market efficiency, and ultimately the safety that our citizens desire, that they need. Jessica, you talked about a modality of, how do we actually go from awareness to resilience and affirmative, kind of a proactive. If there was an Irish statesman on the stage by the name of Edmund Burke, he would say all that's necessary for the triumph of evil in this space is for the good people to do nothing. And I think we need to be on the front balls of our feet in that regard. Yoichi, you mentioned the government has unique powers and it must use them, but for the benefit of the private sector, not merely to use them. The purpose of power is to use it for those that gave it to you in the first place. We talked about the consequential tools like regulation and such, but those must be harmonized across multiple parties, multiple nations. And lastly, the continuous dialogue that each of you engaged in here, but each of you actually foster in your own countries. That's, I think, goes without saying, that's how the basis of trust and resilience is established. I would simply conclude by saying the following. There's clearly beneficial diversity up here on the stage. That's a feature. That's hugely featureful. There's more in common than there's not in terms of the various perspectives that are represented on the stage. And we all are so lucky to have these public servants kind of serving the needs of a global society that needs digital infrastructure to meet their expectations. So if you join me in a round of applause.